Greetings, everyone. Thanks for joining us again here for Lessons from Leaders. We're so lucky we have Shamil Idriss here, who's the CEO for Search for Common Ground. And just a teeny bit about his own background is that he was telling me he grew up, and this is a quote, across dividing lines. And because of his background, that led him to dedicate his work and his life to peace building, which is the work that Search for Common Ground does, being the largest peace building organization in the world. And three things about Search for Common Ground that impressed me was one, that the foreign minister for Iran and the former Secretary of State Kerry both acknowledged the work that Search for Common Ground did in getting the Iran nuclear agreement. The Quakers nominated Search for Common Ground for a Nobel Peace Prize last year, which is fabulous. And then a very high-ranking diplomat, American diplomat in the African Affairs Division, also has acknowledged Search for Common Ground's work in preventing genocide in Burundi. So what I love about these stories is it tells us the impact that the organization is making in the world. And we're so happy that you are here with us today to talk to us about how you see leadership, the challenges and the joys, and some of the struggles you see in the nonprofit sector.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here, Lynn.
Good. I thought for starting out, maybe we give a little tantalizing bit about your growing up across dividing lines. If you want to just say a little bit about that, so we're not on tenterhooks wondering what that means.
Well, I don't mean to make it sound too dramatic. My mother was born in Turkey and my father in Syria, and I was born here in the United States. And we would go back to what was then sort of rural Turkey. It's now where my mother's entire extended family lived in one large compound. With everyone in each other's business, a pretty poor part of the country. It's now a small city. So we would do that every summer. And yet we were growing up in New Canaan, Connecticut. My parents did everything they could, like a lot of immigrant parents try to do, to get my brother and I to the best education system possible. So New Canaan, Connecticut is a very privileged, a wealthy part of this country. We were the only Muslim family that I knew growing up in New Canaan. But we had access to wonderful public education. Every summer, once I started taking summer jobs and not going back to Turkey every summer, I got into my teen years and I was taking these jobs. I started working for the public interest research groups, the PIRGs, Ralph Nader's organization, doing door-to-door canvassing for environmental and consumer protection causes, getting a lot of doors slammed in my face, learning how you raise money and how you get signatures, this kind of thing. And the culture of the PIRGs was very sort of young, activist, very anti-corporate. Corporations were the enemy, sort of. And yet growing up in New Canaan, the parents of some of my closest friends were CEOs or high-level executives of some of the biggest corporations in the world. And then I went from New Canaan, where the politics was fairly conservative, to Swarthmore College, which was both much more diverse and much more politically liberal than what I had grown up with. So anyway, all of that, whether it was going back and forth to Turkey and New Canaan, Connecticut, or it was going back and forth between a very liberal, very conservative, entirely non-Muslim, majority Muslim populations, all of these things, it made it very difficult for me, as I developed really close relationships and respect for people across all those supposed dividing lines, it made it very difficult for me to buy, when folks thought, all the good was over on this side and all the bad was on that side. And that's just how I grew up.
That's interesting. So not only like cross-culturally being the first generation American, but also different socioeconomic. There's so many layers to that.
Yeah, I think a lot of people these days, increasingly people are having this experience of growing up with multiplicity of identities and insights into lots of different cultures. And
do you, in your job, do you bring that with you consciously, or is it so part of you you don't know that it's there?
I think it's very much imbued. I mean, to be honest with you, in talking about this as what motivated me to get into peace building, it's really only in retrospect that I sort of connected those dots. At the time, I just realized, wow, there's something about Swarthmore College's culture that made me want to go there. It was only upon reflection later that I realized, as a Quaker school, you get exposed to conflict resolution, and I got trained as a mediator, and just that culture is embedded within it are a lot of the values and insights that I just sort of grew up with, seeing a lot, starting from a point of respect for diversity, seeking to understand that even or especially those that you most disagree with, all of that. And so it wasn't sort of a rational process for me. I think, in looking back on how did I get into this field, I realized that I think to some extent it was sort of baked in from the experiences that I was having from a young child all the way through to adulthood.
That makes sense to me. Because I know that we just put one foot in front of the other and we don't think I'm heading for this place. This is interesting and that's interesting and I'm liking this, and only in retrospect do we see how we got there.
I mean, there are those people who say, I knew from the age of whatever what I would be. I mean, I just turned 47 last week, and I don't know what I want to be when I grow up. So I've never been one of those people who I admire. To some extent, I admire people who are that directed. I've always been very, very fortunate to follow what seemed most exciting or interesting to me, and that's led me, down this path.
And I wanted to jump in. You and I were talking the other day about your thoughts about some of the challenges of the nonprofit sector. And I wanted to go there right away because for you, that was at the moment, that seemed to be something that you had on your mind that you wanted to make sure that we covered. You were talking about the dynamics that impact the nonprofit sector. Do you remember what they were?
Yeah, I mean, there's one in particular that I think affects the internal management of nonprofits, and there's another that really speaks to the external activism and the social change agenda and how it's pursued. So on the first one, and not wanting to be misunderstood, I think there are many excellent managers and leaders across the nonprofit sector. I think the sector is chronically hamstrung in terms of attracting and retaining quality management, and challenged sometimes for a couple of reasons. One, which has gotten more attention in the last several years from certain donors in particular, is the impact that the donor culture has on nonprofits. So what I would call the sort of arbitrary and wrong-headed focus on low overhead rates as somehow a marker of quality nonprofits is a way to ensure that you're always under-resourcing management systems, the organization foundation, the level of and the experience of managers that you can recruit and attract. And again, it's not to say that you can't get brilliant managers who are willing to work for free or close to free, but that pressure, which doesn't really exist at all in the for-profit sector, I think chronically undercuts the kind of management that you can, recruit and retain. If I buy a product from a company, I really couldn't care less how much they spent on this versus that in producing that product. Is it a good product or not? Is it worth the cost or not? And I think in the nonprofit sector, you want to use the term bang for the buck, is the social change that this organization is able to deliver worth the investment that is being sought? That really, in my view, should be the bottom line. And the notion that, well, it'll be much better if we're only covering 3% of their overhead costs versus whatever, really is a chronic problem in the field. So that's one thing. I think a second thing that affects internal management, which I've sort of learned through failure, probably more than anything, and I've been reflecting on this a lot in my current position, is the you'll see a lot of nonprofits, and we've had this too, where people will be frustrated internally and say, we're not living by our values. We're not walking the talk. And that's a very consistent critique of a lot of nonprofit organizations that you see. And I think absolutely that's sometimes the case. Maybe a peacebuilding organization like ours, maybe we don't always do the best job of dealing with conflict internally, or a climate change organization maybe doesn't always have all the policies you would expect them to have, relative to protecting the environment. But I think oftentimes what happens is that notion of this organization isn't walking the talk is sort of a proxy for something that happens so often in the nonprofit sector, which is that we never really make the effort to explicitly articulate the values that we want to define our work culture, our organizations internally. And I think that happens a lot because people will presume that the external mission of the organization should provide all of the principles and values that are relevant for working there. And it's true, there are certain values that are absolutely embedded in the mission. As a peace-building organization, clearly the dignity of every perspective, the dignity of every individual, and therefore inclusion is a really important principle and value for our organization. It's similarly collaboration. There's a high premium on collaboration because we believe in all of our work that dialogue is necessary but insufficient as a way to really build community. You have to get people collaborating across dividing lines. So you can posit certain values from any nonprofit's mission, but that doesn't say anything, or that doesn't say everything about how you intend and want to work internally. You could say, for instance, that we work in such a challenging environment, and that opportunities come up, oftentimes without able to plan for them. So when opportunities come up, we're going to be incredibly opportunistic. We're going to drop everything else, and we're going to do whatever it takes to get the jobs done. That's your end. So weekends, holidays, be damned, whatever it might be, that's what's expected. Or you could say, we put a real premium on inclusion. So we're going to understand that sometimes we might move slower, or we might require much more consultative processes that might, take more time to generate decisions. But that's really important to us. Or you could say, we're inherently risky. We want to take big risks, and we're trying to do big things. Therefore, we're going to tolerate really high fail rates. We're going to understand that, we're going to fail fairly often. That's okay with us. But whatever it is, I think I've learned through mainly mistakes on this front, that it's really important to take the time to articulate those values, and not a laundry list of them, but a real limited number of them, beyond and in addition to what your mission says your values are. And then be very explicit with them, about them, not just so that people know what they're walking into when they come in. Hire and promote, but also fire according to those values. Develop rituals that reinforce them. Be obsessive about them to the point where it's sort of ad nauseum, everybody who comes in to an organization. And I've been thinking about this a lot lately because we're just going through this process now at Search for Common Ground, or really trying to take a fresh look at what our values are, beyond and in addition to the values that are imbued in our conflict transformation and peace building mission. What kind of place do we want to be? What kind of workplace do we want to be? And I think oftentimes when you don't do that, people come in with wildly different work styles, expectations of the work-life balance they want to have or will have, expectations of what it means to work on an effective organization, all of these kinds of things that rarely are answered by the external mission statement of the organization, And so that's something that I think plagues a lot of nonprofit organizations, or at least in organizations I've run, I've seen that, and trying to learn from that. So that's a second one. I think in terms of, so that's all on the internal, whether it's the low overhead rates and what that does to securing and retaining good management, or it's the inattention to the internal values and the work culture that we want to create and being explicit about it. And incidentally on that one thing I've also looked at is the degree to which organizations and companies that do that well, they do hire and fire according to that. So they don't just fire or withhold promotions for poor performance. This is sort of separate from performance. You could have an excellent performer, but who's doing it in a way that's contrary to the organization's values, and that person's got to go, or they've got to change, So those are all on the internal. On the external, I think.
So before you go on, let's just hold up there. So don't forget the external. So the first one is of course very interesting, and everyone who's worked in a nonprofit knows that's a false measurement, how low the overhead is, if that's a measure of a good or an effective nonprofit or not. And I love your metaphor of if you're going to buy a car, you don't care how. That wasn't the example you gave, but if you don't care
Sure.
what their overhead is.
What do they pay on advertisement? What do they pay on the paint job versus the, exactly, who cares?
Is this the product that I want? And I love that I hadn't in my own mind reached that end point? Is this the product that's effective? If it is, what do we care what the overhead is? Because we're achieving the goal that we said we want to achieve. We being the collective humanity. We want these people to learn to read, or the children to, not die when they're 5 or whatever. Is this the product that we want? What do we care what the overhead is? So I liked that a lot. The second bit is I also hadn't thought about the values, that why people come in believing that, these values that we're upholding for our work should also be part of our values here. What I see, and I've had discussions with organizations about whether you do have a separate set of values that are just on how we work together, or how what our organization is, what the culture is. What I see a lot of struggle with, and this is where I wanted to pause you right here because you spoke about your own failures, which I love hearing failure stories, is what I see is people, even if organizations set their internal values or culture, leaders have a hard time holding that. This is what we're doing. This is the behavior I'm expecting of you. And there's no, you may be the best sanitation engineer in the world, but your behavior is not fitting our values. That seems to be very difficult for a lot of nonprofits. And leaders don't keep in my experience, many people have a hard time keeping their eye on that ball. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, when I looked at this, there are two sides to what I'm hearing you say, I'm projecting at least one, and you definitely said the other. So,
yes.
So one side is that I think articulating those values, but then leaders not reflecting them in their own behavior. That's a real problem, right? So that will very quickly get people in the organization. I think if you become obsessive about those values and you're hiring, promoting, firing according to them, and you have rituals that celebrate them and incentivize them and all these things, and yet when difficult decisions are being made, in particular, the decisions don't seem to at all draw upon that set of values, I think then you've got a real problem. And so that's one side. I think that's one side of it. I think if, as we're going through this process now at Search, maybe you and I can talk in another year, or, or perhaps more accurately, you should talk to others in the organization on how we're doing. I think that people in the organization should feel like we're all accountable to one another for living by those values. And that includes anyone in the organization being able to say, hold on a second, CEO or president or VP of whatever, like we have this set of values. We just came up against a really critical, difficult decision. And the rationale for the decision you made seems completely, contrary to what you said. And so I think that's one side of it. I think the other side of it is largely about good or bad management, right? I mean, being able, you're like following through on that kind of, and remaining disciplined and consistent and reliable in the feedback that you're giving people and the way that you're managing folks. And I'm not going to pretend to be really good at this. Just less than a year ago, I split my job into two. I used to be the CEO and president, and we recruited a president. I split my job into two for two reasons. One was really around this, not just specifically the values piece, but the broader issue of recognizing managing a relatively large organization, or at least large for me. I mean, in the universe of executives you've interviewed, Search for Common Ground is not huge. All of the major development and humanitarian agencies dwarf us in size and budget and staffing. But we've got more than 700 staff now, and we operate in more than 25 countries. And so it's a complex operation. I've never managed anything nearly that size. And so first thing that I was looking for in a president is someone with really the experience of managing a large, complex international organization. But the second reason was, the peacebuilding sector. This goes to some of the externally facing stuff we'll talk about. We really need to elevate the visibility and credibility of the sector. And what I happen to do better than my management skill set is external representation. So about 95% of my job now is externally facing. But on this point that you're raising, I think that it cuts both ways. Both our managers walking the talk themselves. We articulated these values. Are you actually making decisions according to them? And ideally developing an organizational culture when anybody can hold anyone accountable to that. And second, just having strong management where, wherever you come into the organization, you feel like you have a reliable and consistent experience for more or less. And that's really tough. And we're not there right now as our organization, just because we're very disparate. We've grown in a very decentralized way. And I think if you came into our organization in 3 different spots, you could have 3 very different experiences. Some things would be consistent. So it's a challenge.
So thank you. So what are some of the things that you have, that brought you here? What are some of the insights that you had, or the learnings that you had, that you realized what was happening with people with thinking of values, and that you needed to focus on culture? And how did you get there?
Well, things like, we would be, have an incredible breakthrough or achieve wonderful things, a big fundraising breakthrough, a new programming area, and yet still come across staff, including, really committed staff, who were dissatisfied or felt like the organization, and this very specific critique of, hey, we're not walking the talk. And then someone forwarded to me, I had a conversation with somebody who is in charge of diversity and inclusion in one of the largest foundations in the world. And she was really dealing with this within the foundation world. And she shared with me this article about this very subject. And it happened to take a case study. And it happened to take a case study of a peacebuilding organization, and one that I knew very well. Didn't happen to be ours, but I knew very well.
Right.
And as I read the article, the diagnosis that the article was coming up with seemed to me to be actually completely off. And as I read it, I realized, what, I know that case. And and that really got me thinking, I think this is much more an issue of, I know, for instance, at that organization, when the founder moved on, as oftentimes happens, many nonprofits collapse within 5 years of the founder moving on. And in the case of this organization, they recruited multiple different chief executives until they finally landed on somebody who's very competent but came up from within the organization. But if you look at the succession of people they recruited, I don't think you could come across a more disparate kind of work styles and work cultures that they had grown up. And that said to me, oh wow, being really explicit about what is that work culture that you want to be reinforcing and championing and celebrating and perpetuating. That's something really important. And I'm looking at our own case, I felt like, we haven't done that sufficiently at Search for Common Ground. As I said, we're going through this process now. And I think turning that kind of process into something well beyond, a value statement that sits on people's walls, right, is really where I started looking into how some nonprofits and corporations do become quite obsessive about their values. And it's not just in the job descriptions, but it makes up every performance review harkens back to the values. There are rituals of celebration that are specifically tied to the values. There are multiple ways every week where employees will somehow or another come up into interaction with an explicit articulation of those values. When decisions are made, their genuine justification and then also how they're explained is according to those values. Like, so just a multiple. So, and I realized that, I think I've been very mission driven in my life. And I think I kind of never thought about, to me, all the values that are imbued in peacebuilding as a mission to devote your life to, that seemed to me to be everything that you needed. But actually, I don't think it is. And I don't think it is for most nonprofits. I think you could be a peacebuilding organization that runs, in very different, in incredibly different ways, that has very different work cultures. And I do want to say, I'm not saying that the values related to the external mission are irrelevant. Absolutely not. And there should be, at the very least, real synergy, if not explicit overlap, between some of those values. But all I'm saying is that the external mission statement and the values that are connected to it, oftentimes are not explicit enough about what the work culture is and that we want it to be, and we're going to ensure that it is.
That's excellent. And then just to repeat what you said earlier, then people make assumptions about what the values are, and then they get and there's unhappiness because those assumptions aren't being met.
Right. Oh, gee, I'm being asked to work over the weekend. I'm working for a human rights organization. That's a violation of dignity for me or something. And I don't mean, I'm not laughing that off as if that's irrelevant. It's in some places, you're explicit that that's the kind of place that you're going to be. And so this is a great workforce for certain kinds of people. Like, I would rather come across an organization that was really explicit that these are the values here. You know what you're signing up for when you come in. And when you come in, you can be assured that this can be pretty, it can be reliable, that that's the way this place is going to function according to those values. And you know that, rather than having to presume that or seeing people come in with wildly divergent expectations or management practices and realize, I actually don't know what the values are here. And then the way that oftentimes the complaint comes out is vis-a-vis the only values that have been articulated, which is related to the external mission. That doesn't mean that's irrelevant, but oftentimes that's not the full story of what's going on, I think.
I think that's very, very important. And you've given me a different way to think about it, added to my own thinking. So I appreciate that. I hadn't linked it all to people linking the external values to the way they should be treated internally. And it's not always, they don't always go together. Or not that they don't go together, but there's other things, another bowl that the culture needs to sit in. And I will want to follow up with you because I want to hear what you learned through this process, because deciding what the values are and picking them and putting everything in place and then making it part of the air that you breathe, there's the rub, or there's another layer another mountain to climb.
Yeah, I mean, I do think in that kind of process, it's a combination of articulating what you want them to be and enabling them to surface, because every organization already has a culture, right? I mean, there are already certain values that are being played out. So I don't think it's just a grafting on of some kind of foreign set of values. It's this combination of, hey, as you know, what do we want the values of this organization to be, and sussing out from the global team kind of what are they already, what draws people, what draws our best people and keeps them here.
Yes, that's beautiful.
And we'll see. I'll be happy to talk to you. I'll try to be very transparent and honest about how it's going, because it's a challenge.
And this is a place that I think a lot of NGOs are struggling with, right? Or arriving at this place where you're arriving at, and so it'll be a good learning for others. So your own lessons learned. So let's continue on to the external, because this is also very interesting. We talked about it the other day, and was new. It was changed my thinking. So I believe you're going to talk about the peace building. Are you going to talk about peace building?
Well, there are two here too. There are two. So there's one that I think, in my humble opinion, is I don't want to overstate that. It's chronic, but it's very prevalent, I think, in the nonprofit sector generally. And there's another that's really specific to what makes for effective peace building. So on the first one, this one ties to, frankly, kind of part of what draws me to the peace building field. I think there are probably 100 ways to make social change, but there are two in particular that I think are relevant here. There's an adversarial approach to driving change, and there's a collaborative approach. And I think we in the United States, we across cultures globally, we in the social change world, whether it's on human rights or environmental issues or whatever it might be, we're way over invested in adversarial approaches to drive change. And the more interconnected the world becomes, the more that the big issues we have to solve are going to require unprecedented levels of cooperation. For instance, climate change. You got to have all countries have to be on board. You have to have the public and private sector working together. There's just a level of cooperation to tackle climate change. Preventing the spread of nuclear weapons, nuclear nonproliferation. If one party isn't playing by that role, that's enough to, or the preventing the spread of pandemic disease. And you can go down any of the major issues today. The world is so interconnected that whether we like it or not, most of the major issues require us to generate an unprecedented level of collaboration and cooperation across cultures, across nations, across the public-private sector, across generations, et cetera. And so the adversarial approach, which I would sort of describe in 3 steps, identify an issue you really care about. And I think any of your viewers could, just do this on their own. Identify an issue you care about, identify who agrees with you and who opposes you. And third, organize yourselves with the former to go to war with the latter, literally or figuratively. And the way that approach tends, that's how our political campaigns play out. That's how our judicial system is inherently an adversarial system. That's the way a lot of social change campaigns are organized. And I think I don't want to say that approach is never relevant. I really don't want to say that. But in an interdependent world, I think that approach too often yields temporary victories. Victories where one side wins, but the other side is just biding their time and reorganizing themselves to overcome. And it erodes relations. It erodes trust and respect across communities over time and leads to increased polarization. And I think that in my view, I think we're seeing that in many, many countries today. I think we're definitely seeing that in our politics in the US. I think in the UK, my mother's family in Turkey, I think we have family members who have, let's just say, very divergent views about the political situation in Turkey, so much so that they've agreed just not even to talk about it. And on and on and on. The collaborative approach to social change, I could also describe in 3 steps. It starts from the same step. You choose an issue you really care about. But the second step is to identify all the stakeholders. Stakeholders is sort of an old-fashioned word, but identify everyone whose lives are going to be affected by how that issue plays out. And then the third step is to do whatever you can to build trust, respect, and collaboration across those stakeholder groups to tackle the issue together, to frame it in a way that everyone feels welcome, to address it and this sounds theoretical, but I think this is quite. But frankly, this goes to the core of what Search for Common Ground does around the world. And I can tell a quick story about the founding of our organization. We grew out of the U.S. engagement in Vietnam. My predecessor, the founder of the organization, John Marx, was a foreign service officer, an American foreign service officer. And he quit the foreign service in protest to the war. And then he joined the staff of the Republican senator who drafted the legislation that cut the funding to the war, which, as you probably know, is what ended the American involvement in Vietnam, is that Congress stopped paying for it. And then he went on to a highly successful career as an investigative journalist. And he wrote 2 best-selling exposés of the CIA, which got him in a lot of hot water. And so he was becoming, I don't know if you say a cult figure, but he was becoming somewhat of a known figure in the whole kind of anti-war, anti-establishment movement of the late 60s and 70s. And towards the late 70s, John had what to this day he describes as a real epiphany, a life-changing realization, really on 2 fronts. One was, as he describes it still to this day, that his entire life was oriented around adversarial advocacy. He was spending all of his time trying to tear down the old system rather than build a new system. I think a lot of people feel that kind of exhaustion and negativity in their lives right now. And second, that as clear and black and white as all of the issues seemed to be that he was concerned with, once he actually met people who disagreed with them, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, he found that they were people of real integrity, of genuine values, of respectable, and understandable interests. And that just made it a lot harder. So, John came through a life of real out there activism and trying to change the world. He came to the realization that I think I came to at a much younger age without working nearly as hard at it, because it's just kind of how I grew up, of seeing values in different. And I want to say something, because whenever you talk about this, immediately the question of power comes up. Well, there are power differentials, and sometimes you do have just bad actors, right? And you've got people who profit off of all kinds of injustices, and that's absolutely true. And my experience is that we way overestimate the with and kind of people who are quote unquote beyond the pale in that way. In the experience that we have at Search for Common Ground now, working with a lot of governments, for instance, that let's just say not all of them are protecting the human rights of their citizens and are what we found is there are rapacious leaders. I mean, there are people who are pillaging and kind of, there are also a lot of leaders who are really struggling with how limited the tools of government are today in dealing with the way conflict happens today. Behind closed doors, we find a lot of government leaders who frankly are scared of their own youth populations, who don't know how to deal with transnational movements, white supremacist groups or violent extremist groups, etc. So I'm going into all of that because I don't put out this dichotomy of adversarial versus collaborative approaches in a way so as to ignore that there is good and bad in the world, but I think that if you look at efforts to drive social change, it so often paints a whole lot of people as being beyond the pale or not worthy of the dignity and respect that I would say they are. And in a way, it's a lot easier to mobilize people that way by painting an enemy that we're going to go after and combat. There's I don't know, your viewers will remember Jesse Helms, the very conservative North Carolina senator. They might know also Bono, the U2 rock star. So people might not know this story, but for me, this is a very good story of very prominent people who are involved in this kind of process, right? This kind of collaborative approach. And you can read about this. I think this was written up in The Guardian and a couple other places. I actually had the opportunity to talk to Bono about this and confirm that from his point of view, this is what happened. And I didn't get to talk to Helms before he passed. But Jesse Helms was one of the longest standing and most conservative members of the U.S. Senate from North Carolina. Very powerful. I think he chaired the Foreign Relations Committee for many years. And at a certain point, in trying to address the issue of African debt relief and increasing humanitarian assistance to Africa, Bono came to realize that Helms would be a really critical person. So he reached out and started to get to know Helms. And these images of Bono in his sunglasses meeting Helms in his Senate office. And he found that they bonded over Christian values and principles. And Bono grew up in a very religious family, and Helms, Christianity was really quite important to him, and was it was deeply meaningful for him. It was an important part of who he was, and it was in his identity and his self-identity. And they bonded over this, and they met many times. At one point, Helms even went backstage to one of Bono's concerts. I would have paid to see that as well. But the story goes that Bono was facing all kinds of heat from his lead guitarist and other people. Why are you humanizing this guy? Why are you reaching out across these dividing lines? But at a certain point, they had a real deep connection, and the story goes that Helms actually broke down crying at one point, recognizing the devastating impact on millions of African lives that the debt burden was having, and that many other development legacies of colonialism, etc., were having. And he became one of the biggest champions, both for African debt relief and for major humanitarian assistance to Africa. And I think if Bono had taken the much more trodden path of, I'm going to mobilize people against Helms, I'm going to paint him as an evil guy who doesn't care about the rest of the, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, maybe they would have gotten this kind of thing done, but he wouldn't have made Helms an ally. It wouldn't have stuck, I don't think, in the way that it ended up doing, and I'm doubtful it would have ever happened to begin with. That's one prominent example. I mean, and we have many examples at Search. If you have time for it, I'd love to tell you just one from our own community, because I was so, our Kenya director, Judy Kamamo, she saw something going on that a lot of our teams see right now, which is that, again, as security forces and governments struggle to deal with violent extremism, a lot of them are taking approaches because they oftentimes don't know any better, and they retreat to what they know when they don't have particularly creative ideas on how to tackle these issues. And the policies that they implement, oftentimes the medicine's worse than the cure is worse than the disease, as they put it, right? The medicine's worse than the disease. So this was happening in Kenya, where Al-Shabaab was, coming in, and a violent extremist group was using the shores to infiltrate and then to escape. The government, trying to tackle this issue, finally got so frustrated they just banned night fishing. They banned fishing at night. Well, that's pretty fundamental part of the economy on the coast of Lamu and up and down that coast. And so it was having a devastating effect on the economy. And frankly, it was yielding to a real recruitment of Kenyan youth to al-Shabaab. So Judy started facilitating these conversations between Kenyan youth, the fishermen, and the security agencies that eventually led them to sitting on the same, rather than, the metaphor of sitting across from each other, seeing each other as the problem, sitting on the same side of the table, facing the shared problem. And they ended up coming up with some very creative and specific things, like electronic IDs that could be scanned for fishermen, that you would get registered as a fisherman, and they reopened night fishing. This was just 2 years ago, and revived basically the economy of an entire region. And we see this kind of thing again and again and again. Where when the relations aren't there between communities and government, or national people in charge of national security don't have a lot of experience or creativity, and they retreat to what they know when they're dealing with instability that they don't know how to handle. So this is the first real big thing that I'm seeing in the nonprofit sector generally, not just in peacebuilding. It is a over-reliance on an adversarial approach to drive change that I think too often yields Pyrrhic temporary victories, bad relations, and over time, more and more polarization. And the last thing I would say about it is I think there's something incredibly powerful about a collaborative approach that really aligns your means and your ends. I think it's very hard to create a just and collaborative society through adversarial means. And so I think there's also at a principle level, even beyond the sort of tactical and practical level, I think collaborative approaches are something we feel quite strongly about it at Search.
I love those stories. And of course, I think of Nelson Mandela, who famously who saw his enemies as he had to see them not as enemies to move things forward. It also goes back to what you were talking about earlier about your culture and values. If this is what you're trying to do in the world, you have to bring it home to how people work with each other in the organization, right?
Yeah.
And
yeah.
that's...
And it's interesting that you mentioned Mandela. We gave Archbishop Tutu a Common Ground Award many years ago, and in his speech, he said, "You need to see your adversaries as friends waiting to be made." That's the way he put it.
That's perfect. That gave me goosebumps. Yeah.
And I think that it's interesting too when you take people. Oftentimes this sort of, do I choose an adversarial approach or collaborative approach? People break this down in a real false dichotomy between justice on one side and peace on the other. That there's something somehow more principled about being adversarial, and weaker about being collaborative. And I think that's absolutely wrong. And when you look at people like Mandela or Martin Luther King or Gandhi, or, you see people who, both the justice advocates and the peace advocates, embrace them as heroic figures and models to be emulated. So we know, even through those examples, that actually there is nothing contradictory here, or it's challenging, but you can sort of take those approaches. And there's a metaphor, there's a martial art in at Search's founding. We used to talk about this a lot, and I'm starting to talk about it more these days because I think in the current adversarial politics, people get it. The martial art of Aikido. If anyone's ever watched an Aikido master, you can go to YouTube and watch any Aikido match, right? You see an Aikido master. You'll never see an Aikido master strike anyone, right? They never strike back. And the whole idea of Aikido is to get both yourself and your attacker to a safe place. To get both yourself and your attacker to a safe place, right? So you see Aikido masters where people are kicking and swinging at them and they are deflecting the strikes by just 5 degrees, or flipping their adversary but making sure they land, and essentially exhausting their attackers. And I think that, frankly, I think the common ground approach, the collaborative approach, is sort of the Aikido approach to social change. It's neither retreating and being weak, but nor is it responding in kind with force or an adversarial approach. It's going in a completely different direction that's really powerful.
And I love getting both the attacker and self to a safe place. It's not one is above the other. We're both, this is the goal. We're both going to be safe.
And I think you have to be careful, and I would never tell somebody who's on the receiving end, of power dynamics. I would never lecture them on how they should, how they should respond to being falsely imprisoned or tortured or persecuted. I don't want to be misunderstood here. This is about what approach do we each take, and who are the people, and what is the kind of social change that we each want to support. And so at Search, without in any way denigrating people who feel the need to take other approaches, we are 100% committed to the collaborative common ground approach. I think what we do feel very strongly about, and what I feel personally very strongly about, the notion that that approach is somehow weaker, less principled, or frankly even less effective than an adversarial approach, I think is exactly wrong. And I think increasingly, as the world gets more interconnected and these problems become, we're more interdependent, whether we like it or not, I think the more and more the truth of that is going to bear out for people.
And I'm watching the time, and one other thing that we wanted to cover was, before we say goodbye to you, was how we misunderstand what peace-building organizations are.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, yeah. I mean, what I've found with peace building that's very hard right now, and I think a lot of my peers, both who are working for dedicated peace building organizations like Search, or who are just out there doing really good work as community peace builders. Like this, this is not a bureaucratized field, nor should it be. I think what I find is that people don't think of peace building as a field, right? Or to the extent they think of it, they tend to have very outdated and pejorative notions that peace building is about holding hands and singing songs. It's sort of nice when you can afford it, but it's not relevant in the real world. And that is such a mischaracterization of how much the practice of peace building and citizen-led peace building has evolved over the last 40 years. The reason that we have community leaders, religious leaders, CEOs of major multinational corporations, national security advisors of major countries seeking partnership with us, supporting the work that we're doing, asking for help, is not because we're just about holding hands and singing songs. That you do some of that in peace building, of course, in the right context, but it's I think a much better developed approach to driving social change and to solving shared problems, which more and more leaders today at all different levels of society are realizing that they need, and they're looking for better ways. So, quickly I could tell you there are basically three elements of our approach that we would like to see mainstreamed much more, even within the peace building field, let alone beyond. The first is, I think our analytical perspective has a lot to do, with things, and we make a conscious choice to look for signs of hope and to invest in them. Some people call this an asset-based approach. There's a whole field called appreciative inquiry, which if your viewers haven't looked into it, I encourage people to just look up what appreciative inquiry says. It's a very well-researched field, but essentially appreciative inquiry says that the worst way to change behavior is to punish bad behavior. The best way to change behavior is to identify, celebrate, incentivize every step, even the most incremental step towards the desired behavior. And so the way this plays out in peace building is I think there's oftentimes an over-reliance on a fragility-based approach or conflict assessment where you look, it's almost like being a trauma surgeon doing triage. You look, what are the worst problems, and let's try to tackle the worst problems. The problem with that approach is if you go into a place like Syria or Yemen or frankly Chicago, you go anywhere and you wanting to deal with police community relations or tensions, and you take that problem-focused approach, it tends to be a recipe for cynicism and hopelessness. Because even when you come across signs of hope, you tend to dismiss them. Oh, she's wonderful, but she's one woman in a patriarchal society. What difference can she make? Or that police captain is trying to get discipline over his cadets and his police officers, but he's one police captain in a really corrupt, out of control police force. What difference can he make? So what we've found is when you take an appreciative inquiry approach or a hope-based approach to all, when that's the perspective you take in, you ask a different set of questions. If it's an ethnic divide, you ask, is there anybody across this divide who you trust? If it's a corrupt government, is there one minister who's trying to serve the population? If it's an out of control military or police force, is there a captain, a colonel? Is there a beat cop? Is there anybody who's and what you find is 100% of the time, 100% of the time, even in the most seemingly hopeless situations, you get lots of answers. And when the same names come up again and again from that kind of an approach, those are the people and the institutions that we gravitate towards, that we try to work with. The second step that we'd like to see a lot more of is really support for local peace building. All of our teams, both our staff and the constellation of partners that we work with, I would call them transformative teams. A transformative team is local. It represents the dividing lines that they seek to bridge. You know, if you're going to go into even, let's take the Chicago example again. If you want to work on youth-police relations, it might help a lot if you had some retired police officers, former gang members, and other people on your team or among your partners, or determining, you know, how to strategize. So that's the second part of our, you know, you start with a place of hope, and then you build and support a network of local partners, local peace builders. And the third element is that all of the cooperation that those local teams are really trying to drive across dividing lines is not intended just to resolve a specific dispute or solve a specific problem, but to really drive a systemic change in how communities deal with difference. And what we found is that tends to come in one of three forms. You either catalyze a shift in institutional behavior, like the police adopt a community policing approach, or, you know, whatever it might be, or you're able to affect a shift in social norms, how a critical mass of the population deals with these differences, or you can give rise to local markets that fund and pay for an ongoing locally led peace building intervention. Any one of those three forms of change, the thing that's common about them is if you achieve that level of change, it no longer has any reliance whatsoever on external support. It will sustain and grow, you know, on its own. And so those are the three elements of peace building approaches that we don't think are really well understood and are not universally practiced. Starting from a place of hope, you know, identifying and supporting local peace builders that represent the dividing lines, and working with them to drive really systemic change, not just resolve specific disputes.
Very beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing with us. And I'm watching the time, and I know I don't want to take up too much more of your time, but I so appreciate this. Has been a great conversation.